September the 5th, 1914. A French artillery battery commander named Captain Henri Moreau stood in a wheat field 30 miles east of Paris, watching the horizon darken with dust from advancing German columns. His battery of 4 Canon de 75 Model 1897 field guns, the famous French 75, had been in continuous retreat for 2 weeks. The German First Army under General Alexander von Kluck was sweeping toward the French capital in what seemed an unstoppable tide. Moreau's gunners, exhausted and demoralized, prepared their pieces for what they assumed would be another fighting withdrawal. None of them knew they were about to participate in the most decisive artillery action in military history, a battle where the French 75 would prove itself the weapon that saved France and changed warfare forever. The German advance into France in August 1914 had been catastrophic for the Allies. Following the Schlieffen Plan, 7 German armies crashed through Belgium and into northern France like a steel avalanche. The French, committed to their doctrine of offensive à outrance, all-out offensive, had launched disastrous attacks into Alsace-Lorraine that resulted in over 300,000 casualties in the war's first month. The British Expeditionary Force, though professional and well-trained, numbered only 100,000 men, a drop in the ocean compared to the millions Germany had mobilised. By early September, German forces had advanced over 200 miles in just over a month, reaching the Marne River within sight of Paris. The French government evacuated to Bordeaux. Victory seemed certain for Germany, another repetition of the 1770 when Prussian armies had crushed France in a matter of months. But the Germans didn't know about the gun. More specifically, they didn't understand what 3,800 French 75s, deployed in massed batteries and handled by crews trained to perfection, could do to infantry advancing in the open. The Canon de 75 Model 1897 represented a revolution in artillery design so profound that military historians mark its introduction as the beginning of modern artillery. Designed by a team led by Colonel Albert Duport at the Atelier de Puteaux, the French 75 incorporated innovations that rendered every previous field gun obsolete overnight. The key breakthrough was the hydro-pneumatic recoil system, the first truly effective recoil mechanism in artillery history. Before the French 75, field guns had no recoil absorption. When fired, the entire gun would leap backwards several feet, requiring the crew to manhandle the piece back into position and re-aim before firing again. A well-trained crew could fire perhaps 2 rounds per minute. The French 75's revolutionary recoil system changed everything. When fired, the barrel recoiled backward along a slide while a hydraulic buffer absorbed the recoil energy, then pneumatic springs returned the barrel to battery automatically. The gun carriage remained stationary, the sights stayed on target. The crew never touched the gun between shots. A trained French crew could fire 15 rounds per minute sustained, 30 rounds per minute in brief bursts. This rate of fire was unmatched by any artillery piece in the world. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their standard field gun, the 77mm FK-96, required re-aiming after every shot and could manage only 4 rounds per minute. The French 75's shells were equally revolutionary. The standard round was a 75-lethal high-explosive shell, weighing 16 pounds, filled with melanite, a powerful explosive compound. Upon impact, the shell detonated with devastating effect, creating a lethal fragmentation pattern that could kill or wound everything within a 30-foot radius. But the secret weapon was the shrapnel round. Designed for anti-personnel use, the French 75 shrapnel shell contained 290 hardened steel balls, packed around a small bursting charge with a precise time fuse. When the fuse detonated the shell in mid-air above the target, it created a cone of destruction, 290 projectiles each travelling at over 1,000 feet per second, spreading across an area 100 feet wide and 200 feet deep. A single shrapnel shell fired correctly could kill or wound dozens of men. A battery of 4 guns firing shrapnel at 15 rounds per minute could blanket an area the size of 2 football fields with over 17,000 steel balls in 60 seconds. The Germans had encountered the French 75 in the war's opening battles, but under circumstances that concealed its true potential. In the meeting engagements and rapid movements of August 1914, French artillery batteries were often caught while limbered up, moving or deployed in hasty positions. German infantry, trained in fire and movement tactics and supported by their own artillery, had overrun many French gun positions. The Germans noted the French guns' high rate of fire, but concluded it was offset by inferior tactics and the French army's obsession with offensive operations that left artillery unsupported. What the Germans failed to understand was that French artillery doctrine, when properly employed, was specifically designed to maximise the French 75's unique capabilities. French artillery tactics emphasised massed fires and predetermined defensive zones. Unlike German artillery, which focused on counter-battery fire and supporting infantry advances, French doctrine called for creating kill zones through which enemy infantry would have to pass. French gunners trained extensively in indirect fire, using forward observers and telephone communications to engage targets beyond visual range. They practiced engaging area targets rather than point targets, blanking zones with timed barrages rather than trying to destroy individual enemy positions. Most importantly, they trained to fire rapid sustained barrages, using the French 75's incredible rate of fire to create walls of steel that nothing could survive. By September 1914, the German advance had outrun its logistics. Von Kluck's First Army, originally tasked with wheeling west of Paris to encircle the city, had turned southeast, passing east of Paris in pursuit of retreating French forces. This manoeuvre exposed the German right flank to any counterattack launched from Paris. The French commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, recognised the opportunity. He began concentrating forces for a counter-offensive, bringing troops from across the front and mobilising the Paris garrison. The stage was set for the Battle of the Marne. The Marne sector in September 1914 was largely open farmland, gently rolling terrain dotted with small villages and patches of woodland, ideal country for 1914-era infantry operations, but terrible ground for attackers facing massed artillery. There was limited cover, few hills or ridges that could provide defilade from artillery fire, and excellent fields of fire for defenders. French artillery officers surveying the ground saw it as perfect killing ground. Captain Moreau, positioning his battery on September 5th, noted in his diary that the approaches offer no concealment for troops in mass. Any advance will be in the open, exposed at all ranges from 6,000 metres inward. If the Boche come this way, they will walk into hell. The German army that began advancing across the Marne on September 6th was exhausted. Von Kluck's infantry had marched over 400 miles in 5 weeks, fighting battles at regular intervals. They were short on supplies, their boots worn through, their uniforms in tatters, but their morale remained high. Paris lay just 30 miles away. One more push, their officers promised, and the war would be over. The German infantry advanced in the formations that had worked throughout the campaign, dense columns that could rapidly deploy into assault lines, company and battalion-sized formations moving in waves. These tactics, designed for fire and manoeuvre against enemy infantry, were about to encounter prepared French artillery positions. The French artillery deployment at the Marne was massive. Joffre had concentrated over 1/200 of the precious 75s along the planned defensive line, organised in battalion-strength groups of 12 guns covering assigned sectors. Each battery was connected by field telephone to forward observation posts and to higher headquarters, creating an integrated fire control system that could mass fires rapidly. The guns were positioned in concealed positions behind reverse slopes or in tree lines, invisible to German observers. Ammunition was stocked in enormous quantities. Each gun had 500 rounds immediately available, with thousands more in reserve dumps. The French were ready to fight an artillery battle of unprecedented scale. September 6, 1914, dawned clear and warm. German infantry of the V Corps began their advance at 6 a.m., moving in regimental columns along the roads leading southwest toward French positions. These were veteran formations, men who had marched from the German border without a significant defeat, confident in their training and leadership. Ahead of them, French observation posts watched and waited. At 6:15 a.m., a telephone rang in Captain Moreau's command post. The forward observer reported German columns visible at 7,000 metres, estimated strength 2 regiments, moving in column formation on the main road. Moreau ordered his battery to load high explosive shells and prepare for fire mission. At 6:20 a.m., the order came from battalion headquarters. Commence firing. The French 75s opened fire at maximum range, lobbing shells in high arcs toward the reported German positions. The initial salvos were ranging shots, observers watching the shell bursts and calling corrections. Within 3 minutes, the French gunners had bracketed the German columns. Then the real firing began. Each gun fired at a steady 12 rounds per minute, the maximum sustainable rate that allowed proper laying between rounds. Moreau's 4-gun battery sent 48 shells per minute downrange. Across the sector, 48 French batteries, 192 guns, poured fire onto the advancing Germans. Over 2,300 shells per minute fell on a front 3 kilometers wide. The German columns disintegrated. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt of the 64th Infantry Regiment recorded the experience in a diary recovered after he was killed later in the battle. The shells arrived without warning. One moment we were marching in good order, the next moment hell erupted around us. The explosions were continuous, like a thunderstorm that never ended. Men fell in groups, cut down by fragments. The road became a slaughterhouse. We tried to deploy into assault formation, but the shells followed us. There was no cover, nowhere to hide. The French fire never slackened. Shells fell continuously, methodically, as though being placed by machine. Our casualties were appalling. Within 20 minutes, my company had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The German army had experienced artillery fire before, but nothing like this. The sustained rate of fire from the French 75s was beyond anything in German experience. Their own artillery, limited to 4 rounds per minute, could not suppress the French guns. German infantry, trained to assault through artillery fire, found it impossible to advance through the continuous barrage. Officers who ordered their men forward watched entire platoons disappear in eruptions of steel and high explosive. The Germans tried to locate the French batteries for counter-battery fire, but the French guns were well concealed and firing from positions over 4,000 metres away, beyond the effective range of German field artillery's direct observation. By midday on September the 6th, the German 4-corps advance had stalled completely. Units that had started the day at full strength reported 40 to 50% casualties without ever engaging French infantry. The regimental commanders sent urgent requests to Corps headquarters for artillery support, but German gunners could not silence the French 75s. The French fire control system allowed batteries to shift fires, rapidly massing guns against German concentrations, then dispersing to avoid counter-battery fire. German artillery officers, schooled in dueling enemy batteries, found themselves outranged and outgunned. September 7th saw the Germans try again, this time with more artillery preparation and attempting to advance in more dispersed formations. French artillery responded with shrapnel. The French had observed the German dispersal and calculated that high explosive shells, designed to crater the ground and destroy fortifications, were wasteful against infantry in the open. Shrapnel, which the Germans called the devil's confetti, was the answer. At 7:30 a.m., as German infantry began their advance in extended skirmish lines, French batteries switched to shrapnel shells with time fuses set for airbursts 20 feet above the ground. The effect was apocalyptic. A German infantry lieutenant named Karl Hoffmann survived and described it in a 1920s interview. We advanced in open order, 5 meters between men, as we had trained. We thought this would save us from the artillery. Then the shells began bursting above us, not on the ground but in the air. Each explosion created a storm of metal that swept the ground like an invisible scythe. Men fell in rows, cut down by projectiles we could not see. There was no defence. You could not take cover from something exploding above you. We went to ground, hugging the earth, but the shrapnel found us anyway. The steel balls punched through equipment, through bodies, into the ground around us. I saw men with a dozen wounds, men torn apart by the concentrated impact. The grass was red with blood. The wounded screamed, but no one could help them. The shells never stopped coming. The mathematics of destruction were overwhelming. A single French battery of 4 guns, firing shrapnel at 12 rounds per minute, placed 48 shells over the target area every 60 seconds. Each shell released 290 projectiles, totaling 30,120 steel balls per minute, saturating a killing zone 200 meters long and 100 meters wide. German infantry advancing through this fire faced odds no courage could overcome. Analysis after the battle estimated that German forces attacking across open ground against prepared French 75 positions suffered casualties at a rate of 30% per kilometre of advance. No army could sustain such losses. By September 8th, the German High Command recognised that the offensive across the Marne had failed. Von Kluck's First Army, which had begun the battle with 160,000 men, had suffered over 30,000 casualties in 3 days, with French infantry barely engaged. The majority of casualties came from artillery fire. German after-action reports repeatedly mentioned the devastating effect of French guns, the impossibility of advancing under such fire, and the complete inadequacy of German counter-battery efforts. Von Kluck ordered a withdrawal to more defensible positions along the Aisne River. The high-water mark of the German invasion of France had been reached and turned back, not by heroic infantry charges but by mathematics, engineering, and 3,800 French 75s firing as fast as their crews could load. The Battle of the Marne resulted in approximately 250,000 German casualties and 263,000 French casualties over 2 weeks of fighting across a 200-mile front. But in the critical opening days, along the sectors where French artillery was properly positioned and supplied, the casualty ratio heavily favoured the French. German units attacking across the Marne proper, directly into concentrated French 75 batteries, suffered casualties 3 times higher than French forces. The dream of a quick victory died in wheat fields turned to moonscapes by high explosive shells, under skies darkened by shrapnel. The Germans learned bitter lessons at the Marne. Their infantry tactics, successful against Russian and French forces in the war's opening weeks, were suicide against massed modern artillery. Their own artillery, excellent in mobile warfare and counter-battery missions, lacked the rapid-fire capability to suppress French guns. Most critically, they had underestimated the revolution in firepower that the French 75 represented. German ordnance officers, examining captured French 75s after the Marne, were stunned by the sophistication of the recoil system and the precision of the ammunition. General Erich von Falkenhayn, soon to become German Chief of Staff, wrote in his diary that the French possess in their 75 mm gun a weapon of such superiority that our field artillery is rendered nearly obsolete. Unless we can neutralise their artillery advantage, future offensive operations will be prohibitively costly. The French 75 itself was a masterpiece of late 19th century engineering. The recoil system alone represented years of development. The hydraulic buffer used a mixture of oil and glycerin that remained fluid in winter conditions, something earlier designs had failed to achieve. The recuperator, which returned the barrel to battery, used compressed air at precise pressures that had to be maintained constantly. Each gun required a crew trained to maintain these systems in field conditions. The French army had invested enormous resources in this training. By 1914, French artillery crews were the best trained in the world, capable of maintaining their guns under combat conditions and achieving rates of fire that seemed impossible to other armies. The ammunition production supporting the French 75 was equally impressive. By 1914, French arsenals were producing 12,000 rounds per day, a figure that would increase to over 100,000 per day by 1916. Each shell was manufactured to precise specifications. The high explosive shells required exact amounts of melinite. Too much, and the shell might detonate prematurely; too little, and it would fail to achieve maximum effect. The shrapnel shells were even more complex, requiring 290 hardened steel balls packed precisely around the bursting charge with a time fuse accurate enough to detonate the shell at exactly the right altitude. French industry had mastered these challenges before the war, giving France an artillery ammunition stockpile far exceeding anything Germany possessed. The Battle of the Marne's immediate consequence was the stabilization of the Western Front. Unable to advance against French artillery, the Germans dug in, creating field fortifications that would evolve into the trench systems that defined World War I. The French, recognizing that their artillery had saved Paris, began building their own fortifications. Within months, continuous trench lines stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, and the war of movement transformed into the war of attrition. But the lesson of the Marne was clear. Massed artillery, properly employed, could stop any infantry assault. The French 75 had proved this beyond doubt. In the months following the Marne, both sides raced to increase their artillery forces. The Germans, shocked by their artillery's inadequacy, began crash programs to develop new heavy guns and increase shell production. The French, validated in their faith in the 75, manufactured more guns and vastly increased ammunition production. By December 1914, French industry was producing 50,000 shells per day. by mid-1915, production exceeded 100,000 shells per day. The French 75 became the foundation of French artillery tactics throughout the war, the gun around which everything else was organised. The French 75's performance at the Marne had strategic implications beyond the immediate battle. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan meant Germany would fight the two-front war that German strategic planning had sought to avoid. With France still fighting in the west and Russia mobilising massive forces in the east, Germany faced the prospect of a prolonged conflict. The quick victory that might have allowed Germany to redeploy forces eastward before Russia fully mobilised never happened, largely because the French 75 turned the Marne into a killing ground that no army could cross. The tactical lessons of the Marne took years to fully absorb. The French High Command, convinced that their artillery had won the battle, initially doubled down on artillery-centric tactics. Infantry became almost an afterthought, expected to occupy ground that artillery had cleared. This would lead to disasters at Verdun and the Nivelle offensive, where French commanders learned that artillery alone, even massed French 75s, could not break prepared defences without infantry trained in assault tactics. But at the Marne in September 1914, when the question was simply whether German infantry could advance across open ground against prepared artillery, the French 75 provided a definitive answer. No. German veterans of the Marne spoke of the experience with a mixture of respect and horror. The continuous artillery fire, the inability to locate and suppress French guns, the sensation of being systematically destroyed by an enemy they could not see or reach, all became defining memories. German military literature after the Marne was filled with discussions of the French artillery problem and proposals for countering it. Some advocated better counter-battery techniques, others called for more heavy artillery. Still others suggested night attacks or infiltration tactics that might avoid the killing zones. None of these solutions could be implemented quickly, and in the meantime German infantry faced the prospect of attacking into French 75 fire whenever they went forward. The French gunners who fought at the Marne became heroes in France. Captain Moreau, whose battery had fired over 6,000 rounds during the battle, received the Légion d'honneur. His citation read, "Commanded his battery with exceptional skill and courage during the Battle of the Marne. His guns' fire destroyed multiple German formations, contributing decisively to the enemy's defeat. His professional competence and devotion to duty exemplify the highest standards of French artillery." Similar citations went to hundreds of other artillery officers and thousands of gunners. The French 75 crews had saved France, and the nation knew it. The industrial capacity that produced the French 75 and its ammunition represented French strength that Germany had underestimated. French industry in 1914 was more advanced than most foreign observers realised, particularly in precision manufacturing and chemical production. The ability to produce thousands of precision artillery pieces and millions of shells annually demonstrated industrial capability that Germany had assumed France lacked. This industrial strength would prove critical throughout the war, as France manufactured not only artillery, but also aircraft engines, optical equipment, and thousands of other military necessities at scales that surprised the Germans. The French 75 continued to serve as France's primary field gun throughout World War I and remained in service into World War II. Over 20,000 were manufactured during World War I, and the design was exported to over 30 countries. American forces arriving in France in 1917 were equipped with French 75s, as American industry could not produce an equivalent gun quickly enough. The American Expeditionary Forces artillery was essentially French artillery, manned by American crews trained by French instructors. The gun's influence extended beyond France, inspiring similar designs in Britain, Italy, and eventually Germany, though none matched the French 75's combination of rate of fire, accuracy, and reliability. The Battle of the Marne's artillery duel set patterns that would define World War I. The supremacy of defence over offence, the power of massed artillery, the importance of fire control and communications all became clear at the Marne. German offensive doctrine, which had emphasised speed, mass, and shock action, proved inadequate against prepared artillery. Positions. The war would evolve new tactics, new weapons, new methods, but the fundamental reality established at the Marne remained constant. Artillery was king, and the French 75 was the best field gun in the world. In 1964, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Marne, French and German veterans met at the battlefield for a ceremony of reconciliation. A German veteran, Heinrich Müller, who had been a private in 1914, stood before a preserved French 75 on display and spoke to assembled journalists. "This gun saved France and doomed Germany. We came so close to Paris, so close to victory, and this gun stopped us." I remember the sound, the continuous thunder of French artillery that never stopped, never slackened. We called it the Devil's Hammer. It beat us into the ground. When I see this gun now, I feel the same fear I felt in 1914. It is the weapon that changed everything. Standing beside him, a French veteran, former Captain Jules Moreau, son of Henri Moreau, replied, "This gun did its duty. It defended France when France faced annihilation. We honour it not because it killed, but because it saved." In September 1914, France lived or died by whether these guns could stop the Germans. They stopped the Germans. We honour them for that. The Canon de 75 Model 1897, the French 75, remains one of the most influential weapons in military history. It established the template for modern field artillery. Quick-firing, accurate, reliable, capable of sustained fire at rates that transformed artillery from an occasional presence on the battlefield to the dominant killer. At the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, it proved its worth in the most dramatic fashion possible, turning what seemed an inevitable German victory into a decisive French success. The German advance that had swept across Belgium and northern France like an unstoppable tide broke against French 75 batteries at the Marne and never regained its momentum. The laughter that might have followed a German triumph in Paris never came. Instead, the thunder of French 75s echoed across the Marne, and the course of history changed. The German offensive that was supposed to end the war in 1914 turned to dust under the guns of the French 75, and the world entered 4 more years of industrial warfare. At the Marne, the French 75 fired over 7 million rounds in 2 weeks of battle, approximately 350 tons of steel and high explosive delivered onto German positions every day. That avalanche of metal and fire saved Paris, saved France, and changed the war. The day the French 75 turned an entire offensive to dust was the day that proved modern artillery had transformed warfare forever, and no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome the mathematics of destruction that massed quick-firing guns represented. The Germans learned this lesson at the Marne, paid for it in blood, and never forgot it. Neither did the French, who honoured their 75s as the weapon that saved the nation in its darkest hour. The German withdrawal from the Marne in September 1914 was not a panicked rout, but an organised retreat to defensible positions along the Aisne River. Yet the psychological impact on German forces was profound. Units that had marched victoriously from the Belgian border to within sight of Paris now trudged northward, their columns thinned by casualties, their confidence shaken. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Balck, a staff officer with the German First Army, wrote in his diary on September 10th that the men are exhausted not merely from marching but from the constant artillery fire. They have faced Russian guns, Belgian guns, British guns, but nothing prepared them for the French 75s. The continuous fire, the accuracy, the sheer volume of shells, it breaks the spirit. Men who fought bravely at Mons and Le Cateau now flinch at the sound of distant artillery. They know what is coming. The ammunition expenditure at the Marne shocked both sides. French artillery consumed over 8 million rounds in 2 weeks, more than the entire stock of artillery ammunition that existed in French arsenals at the war's start. French war planners had estimated that 100,000 shells per month would suffice for a short war. At the Marne, batteries were firing 100,000 shells per day. The rate of consumption forced immediate changes in French industrial planning. Every factory capable of machining brass was converted to shell production. Chemical plants that had manufactured dyes and fertilizers switched to explosive production. The French war economy, initially oriented toward a short conflict, pivoted to total war in a matter of weeks, driven by the simple reality that the French 75s were useless without ammunition. The German General Staff conducted extensive analysis of the Marne defeat throughout the fall of 1914. The artillery question dominated these assessments. General Erich von Falkenhayn, who replaced Helmuth von Moltke as Chief of the General Staff on September 14th, ordered a complete review of German artillery doctrine and equipment. The resulting reports were damning. German field artillery, particularly the 77 mm Fk-96, was described as obsolete. Its 4 rounds per minute rate of fire was termed inadequate for modern warfare. Its range of 7,800 metres was competitive, but the inability to maintain fire without relaying the gun after each shot meant German batteries could not sustain the fire superiority necessary to suppress enemy artillery or support infantry attacks against prepared positions. The German Ordnance Department began crash programs to develop improved field guns, but German industry faced challenges French manufacturers had solved a decade earlier. The hydropneumatic recoil system required precision machining and materials that German factories were not equipped to produce quickly. German engineers examined captured French 75s in minute detail, measuring tolerances, analysing metallurgy, studying the hydraulic systems. What they discovered was that the French gun represented not just good design, but also manufacturing excellence that would take years to replicate. The Germans could design a gun equal to the French 75, but producing it at scale while fighting a two-front war presented insurmountable obstacles. Instead, Germany opted for a different solution: massive expansion of heavy artillery. If German field guns could not match French 75s in rate of fire, German heavy guns would simply destroy French positions before infantry attacked. The Germans began producing 150mm howitzers, 210mm mortars, and eventually monster guns like the 420mm Big Bertha in quantities never before attempted. This heavy artillery would prove effective in siege warfare and trench assaults, but it could not solve the fundamental problem the French 75 posed: a mobile, quick-firing gun that could engage targets across the entire depth of the battlefield and shift fires rapidly to meet changing tactical situations. German heavy guns were devastating but ponderous, requiring hours to emplace and limited in their ability to engage moving targets or rapidly shifting tactical situations. The French, meanwhile, doubled down on the 75. Production increased from 15 guns per day in August 1914 to over 30 per day by January 1915. Factories working around the clock produced not only complete guns, but also replacement parts, spare barrels, recoil system components. The French artillery park, which had numbered 3,800 guns in August 1914, grew to over 5,000 by December 1914 and would eventually exceed 12,000 guns by 1918. Every French infantry division was assigned a standard complement of 36 French 75s, organised in 3 groups of 12 guns each. Corps artillery added additional 75s for massing fires. The French 75 became the foundation upon which the entire French army was built. The tactical employment of French 75s evolved rapidly after the Marne. French artillery officers developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for fire control and coordination. The use of aerial observation, initially experimental, became standard practice by late 1914. Aircraft spotters equipped with radios could direct artillery fire onto targets beyond the view of ground observers, extending the effective range of French 75s from their visual limit of perhaps 3,000 metres to their maximum range of 8,500 metres. This meant that German forces anywhere within 8 kilometres of the front line were potentially subject to French 75 fire, directed by spotters they could not see or reach. The development of the creeping barrage in 1915 represented another evolution in French 75 tactics. Rather than firing at stationary targets, French batteries would fire a moving curtain of shells that advanced at a predetermined rate, typically 100 metres every 3 minutes. French infantry would advance immediately behind this curtain, catching German defenders while they were still sheltering from the bombardment. The French 75's rapid rate of fire made this tactic possible. A creeping barrage required continuous fire from dozens of batteries simultaneously, all advancing their aim points at precisely timed intervals. Only guns with the French 75's rate of fire and accuracy could maintain the density of fire necessary to make creeping barrages effective. German infantry facing creeping barrages reported a terrifying experience that combined the Marne's overwhelming firepower with the impossibility of defence. Unteroffizier Franz Koch of the 115th Infantry Regiment described a French attack near Arras in May 1915. The bombardment began at dawn, falling on our front trenches with mechanical precision. Every 3 minutes the shells moved closer to our position. We knew what was coming but could do nothing. When the shells reached our trench, we took cover in dugouts. The explosions were continuous, the earth shaking, timbers groaning under the blast. Then, before the bombardment lifted, French infantry appeared through the smoke. They were on us before we could man the fire steps. We lost the trench in minutes. The French 75s had beaten us before their infantry arrived. The French offensive at Vimy Ridge in September 1915 demonstrated both the power and limitations of French 75-based tactics. French gunners delivered over 3 million rounds onto German positions in a week-long bombardment before the infantry assault. The frontline trenches were obliterated. German casualties in the bombardment exceeded 15,000, and the initial French assault captured the first and second German trench lines with relatively light casualties. But as French infantry advanced beyond the range of their supporting 75s, German defenders in deep bunkers emerged and counterattacked. Without artillery support, French infantry were thrown back. The battle demonstrated that the French 75, for all its excellence, had limitations. It could not destroy deep fortifications, it lacked the range to support advances beyond a few kilometres, and its high explosive shells, while deadly against troops in the open, were insufficient against reinforced concrete. This realisation led to the French developing a more balanced artillery park. Heavy guns, 150 mm howitzers primarily, were added to supplement the 75s. The heavy guns would destroy fortifications and deep bunkers, while the 75s would suppress German infantry and machine guns and provide the rapid fire necessary for creeping barrages. But the 75 remained the primary French gun throughout the war. By 1918, French artillery still consisted primarily of 75s, with heavy guns making up only about 30% of the total artillery park. The French never abandoned their faith in the weapon that had saved them at the Marne. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 saw French 75s employed in a defensive role that recalled the Marne. German forces, attacking with overwhelming artillery superiority and heavy guns, initially drove French forces back, but French commanders massed 75s along, the remaining defensive positions creating kill zones similar to those at the Marne. German infantry advancing through these zones suffered catastrophic casualties. Captain Charles de Gaulle, serving as an infantry officer at Verdun before his capture, noted that the German attacks are pressed with fanatical courage, but our 75s destroy them methodically. Company after company advances into the fire, and company after company ceases to exist. The bravery is immense, the futility absolute. Artillery dominates this battlefield as completely as at the Marne, and the 75 remains our salvation. The ammunition consumption at Verdun was even more staggering than at the Marne. French 75s fired over 15 million rounds during the 10-month battle. German forces, despite their heavy artillery superiority, never achieved the breakthrough they sought, largely because French 75s made any infantry advance prohibitively expensive. The Germans would capture ground through overwhelming artillery preparation, but French 75s would make holding that ground impossible, subjecting German positions to continuous fire that prevented consolidation. The battle became an artillery duel of attrition, and while German heavy guns could destroy French fortifications, French 75s killed German infantry faster than Germany could replace them. The American entry into World War I in April 1917 created an immediate crisis: American artillery. The United States Army possessed only 900 field guns total, most of them obsolete. American industry had no capacity to produce modern artillery quickly. The solution was obvious: equip American forces with French 75s. The French agreed to provide not only guns, but also ammunition and training. By November 1918, American artillery units were operating over 3,000 French 75s, making the American Expeditionary Force essentially dependent on French artillery supply. American gunners trained on the 75 at French artillery schools, learning the techniques French gunners had perfected over 4 years of war. American artillery officers were initially skeptical of the French 75, noting its limitations in range and shell weight compared to modern heavy guns, but combat experience converted them. Captain Harry Truman, commanding a battery of French 75s in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, wrote to his future wife Bess that, "These French guns are magnificent. We can fire faster than I ever imagined possible. The Germans hate them. When we open up, German infantry won't advance. They know what our guns can do and they won't face it. I understand now why the French love this gun. It's saved their country and it's helping us win ours." The Meuse-Argonne offensive in September-November 1918 saw French 75s employed by American forces in the tactics French gunners had perfected. Creeping barrages preceded infantry advances, counter-battery fire suppressed German artillery, and massed fires destroyed German strongpoints. American ammunition consumption reached levels that shocked even French observers. The American First Army fired over 4 million French 75 Lussist rounds in 47 days, exceeding 85,000 rounds per day. American industry, mobilized for war production, had begun manufacturing French 75 ammunition in the United States, shipping millions of rounds to France monthly. The combination of French guns and American industrial capacity created artillery firepower that German forces could not match. The German Spring Offensive of 1918, Germany's last attempt to win the war before American forces could tip the balance, ran into the same problem that had stopped them at the Marne: French 75s. German stormtrooper tactics, using infiltration and bypassing strongpoints, initially achieved dramatic successes. German forces advanced 40 miles in places, the deepest advance on the Western Front since 1914. But as German infantry outran their artillery support, they encountered French 75s in prepared positions. The pattern of the Marne repeated, German infantry advancing across open ground into massed French 75 fire, suffering unsustainable casualties, the advance stalling. By June 1918, the German offensive had exhausted itself, and Allied counter-offensives began driving German forces back. The final statistics of French 75 employment in World War I were staggering. Over 20,000 guns produced, more than 200 million rounds fired, German casualties from French 75 fire estimated at over 2 million. The gun had fired more ammunition than all other artillery pieces in French service combined. It had participated in every major French battle from the Marne in 1914 to the armistice in 1917. French artillery doctrine built around the 75 had proven effective despite the gun's limitations. The faith French officers had placed in their gun at the war's start had been validated by 4 years of continuous combat. Post-war analysis by military historians consistently identified the French 75 as one of the war's decisive weapons. British military historian Basil Liddell Hart wrote in 1930 that the French 75 saved France in 1914, gave France the means to resist in 1915 and 1917, and contributed significantly to victory in 1918. No other single weapon played such a continuous and decisive role throughout the war. The machine gun killed more men, the heavy howitzer destroyed more fortifications, but the French 75 was the weapon around which French military power was organised, and without it, France would have fallen in 1914. German military historians, examining their defeat, consistently noted the French 75 as a weapon they never adequately countered. General Wilhelm Groener, who served on the German General Staff throughout the war, wrote in his memoirs that, "We developed heavy artillery superior to anything the French possessed. We created effective infantry tactics. We innovated constantly in technology and doctrine. But we never solved the French 75 problem. That gun could fire faster, more accurately, and more reliably than anything we fielded. In open warfare, as at the Marne, it was devastating. In trench warfare, it provided the rapid fire necessary for effective barrages. We could match French heavy artillery, but we never matched their field artillery, and in the end, that mattered." The French 75 continued in service long after World War I ended. The gun equipped French artillery units through the 1930s and fought again in World War II. While obsolescent by 1940, French 75s still saw combat, and their high rate of fire remained tactically valuable. The Germans, after conquering France in 1940, incorporated captured French 75s into their own artillery park, using them on the Eastern Front and in coastal defence. The gun that had stopped Germany in 1914 ended up serving Germany in 1941, a historical irony not lost on veterans of both wars. The influence of the French 75 extended far beyond France. The British developed the QF 18-pounder, incorporating many French 75 design principles. The Americans, after using French 75s in World War I, developed the M1 75 Mests howitzer, which employed similar recoil systems and fire control concepts. The Soviet Union studied captured French 75s and incorporated their rapid-fire capabilities into Soviet artillery doctrine. By World War II, virtually every major military possessed quick-firing field artillery directly influenced by the French 75's revolutionary design. The Canon de 75 Modèle 1897 represented more than just excellent engineering. It embodied French military philosophy, elegance, precision, and devastating effectiveness through mechanical sophistication. Where other nations pursued bigger guns or heavier shells, France perfected the field gun, creating a weapon that could fire faster, more accurately, and more reliably than any competitor. That this weapon appeared just 17 years before the war that would validate its design represented remarkable foresight by French ordnance officers who understood that future warfare would be dominated by artillery, and that the gun which could fire fastest would control the battlefield. The human cost of the French 75's effectiveness was immense. German casualties from French artillery fire in World War I exceeded 2 million men. French gunners fired 200 million rounds, each shell potentially killing or wounding multiple men. The industrial nature of this killing, artillery crews servicing their guns with mechanical precision, firing at targets they never saw, killing men they never knew, represented warfare's transformation into an impersonal industrial process. The French 75, for all its technical excellence, was ultimately a killing machine of unprecedented efficiency, and its success was measured in the millions of men who died under its fire. Yet for France, the French 75 remained an object of national pride. The gun that saved Paris, that stopped the Germans at the Marne, that held the line at Verdun, that contributed to final victory in 1918, was celebrated as the weapon that preserved French independence. Museums displayed French 75s as national treasures. Memorials featured the gun prominently. Veterans associations adopted the 75 as their symbol. For a generation of Frenchmen, the French 75 was the weapon that prevented France from suffering the fate of 1870, occupation and humiliation. Instead, France had fought, survived, and ultimately prevailed, and the French 75 was inseparable from that achievement. The Battle of the Marne in September 1914 remained the French 75's defining moment. Every subsequent employment, every tactical innovation, every evolution in French artillery doctrine traced back to those days when massed French 75s stopped the German army within sight of Paris. The gun proved its worth in the most decisive fashion possible. It turned certain defeat into stunning victory. It stopped what appeared unstoppable. It validated a decade of French investment in artillery technology. The Germans had laughed at French warfare theories before 1914, dismissing French emphasis on artillery as outdated thinking. At the Marne, the laughter stopped, replaced by the thunder of French 75s firing at rates the Germans could not match, and with effects the Germans could not survive. The legacy of the Marne extended through both world wars and into modern military doctrine. The lesson that massed, quick-firing artillery could stop any infantry assault became fundamental to 20th century military thinking. The emphasis on fire superiority, the understanding that whoever controls the artillery controls the battlefield, the recognition that mechanical firepower could overcome tactical skill, all flowed from the Marne. And at the centre of these lessons was the Canon de 75 Modèle 1897, the French 75, the gun that changed warfare and saved France in the nation's moment of maximum peril. From April morning in 1897, when the first prototype fired at a French testing range, to November morning in 1918, when French 75s fell silent after 4 years of continuous combat, the gun had proven itself the most influential artillery piece of its era, and the Battle of the Marne in September 1914 was the moment when that influence became undeniable, when German columns turned to dust under French shells, and when the course of the 20th century pivoted on the mechanical precision of French gunners and their magnificent weapon.